Hare Krishna, everybody. Thank you for coming along to listen. This is the beginning of the ABC series. The 5S series is finished. So we are starting on a series of ABC all the way to Z. And as I said before, it will mainly be on Bhagavad Gita, but there's going to be a lot of Bible quotes and ideas as well coming in. So, being the letter A, the word that I would like to associate with the letter A is the idea of absolute truth. So, absolute truth is a very important concept in both Bhagavad Gita and Bible. Now, here is, if you were to Google it, what would you get? If you were to go and Google what is the difference between absolute truth and relative truth, then this is what you would get. This is just Google. Relative truth is conditional, subjective, varying, and contradictory. So it's capable of changing over time. In contrast, absolute truth is consistent and eternal. Its meaning is universal and never changing. Now, if you listen carefully to the absolute truth words that Google uses, this is just Google. Consistent, eternal, universal, never changing. That sounds a bit like the description of God himself, doesn't it? So we'll come back to that idea soon. Now, in terms of some examples of relative truth. Now remember, relative truth changes according to what Prabhupada called time, place, and circumstance. So, if a truth can remain true throughout all time, all places, all circumstances, then one could say it's an absolute truth. But if a truth can be modified or different according to time, place, and circumstance, then it's relative. So here's some examples of things that are relative truths. If you were born in the 1800s and someone in your family was going to have a baby, and that baby got born prematurely, say at 22 weeks gestation, it was a truth at that time, an accepted truth at that time, that there'd be no survival for that baby. And yet, time and circumstances has changed that. And that is no longer true. It's no longer a truth at all. We have 22-week-old babies having 10% of them surviving these days. And 24-week-old babies, you have a 60% survival rate. So time and circumstance has changed that truth. There was a time when being diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, where the pancreas doesn't produce insulin anymore. So if you don't have insulin, you can't metabolize glucose, which is very important for yielding energy. Glucose is the food that is combusted or oxidized in the presence of oxygen to give us energy to stay alive. So type 1 diabetes in that era was a definite death sentence. So it was a truth that it was a terminal condition. But it's not a truth anymore, is it? Because now we have treatments and we have insulin shots. So it's no longer a death sentence. So it's another example of a relative truth. If you think about travel, if you wanted to travel from England to Australia as a colonist in the 1800s, it was a truth of the time that it would take weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks of travel on a ship. And now that's not a truth anymore. There's a way faster way to get to Australia, and people hop on planes and are there in less than a day. So, all relative truths. Today you often find when there are commissions of inquiry and such events that people will be asked to speak their truth. Oh, she spoke her truth. She was very brave. She spoke her truth. What does that mean? Her truth, his truth, their truth. Truth is truth. So that's another example of relative truth ruling the world. Everything that we hold to be true tends to just be a relative truth, which means it's not going to be true forever. And it may not be true at all even now. Another small example is, let's say we talk about, is an object on my left or is that object on my right? That can be affected, can't it, by where I'm standing. That depends upon where I place my bodily position as to whether that object is on the left or on the right. So because it's a truth that depends on another factor, in this case my bodily position, because it's a truth that depends on another factor, then it's not an absolute truth. So it's a relative truth. So it seems to be that most of the truths that we have in our modern world are in fact relative truths. Mahatma Gandhi came to that conclusion. Mahatma Gandhi said, nobody in this world possesses absolute truth. This is God's attribute alone. Relative truth is all we know. Therefore, we can only follow the truth as we see it. Such pursuit of truth cannot lead anyone astray. We need to pursue absolute truth, not relative truth. And that's what people in spiritual life are trying to do. Pursue absolute truth. So, coming to some quotes then. According to Bhagavad Gita and the ancient Sanskrit Vedic scriptures that Prabhupada brought to the West, the absolute truth is God himself. Here we have a Bhagavad Gita quote, chapter 10, texts 12 and 13, where Arjuna is speaking directly to Krishna, who had materialized in human form on the earth, one of his expansions. And he said to Krishna, you are the supreme Brahman, the ultimate, the supreme abode and purifier, the absolute truth, and the eternal divine person. So there we have a direct conversation between Arjuna, who was a friend and devotee of Krishna, and Krishna in an embodied, temporarily embodied manifestation or expansion, of which he has innumerable, infinite capacity to do that in whatever form he would like. And there Arjuna recognizes the fact that Krishna is the supreme, the absolute truth is God. Also in the Bhagavad Gita we have chapter 7, text 7, where Krishna says, there is no truth superior to me. So he's literally identifying himself as truth. Chapter 2, text 2, we are told that absolute truth is realized in 3 phases of understanding. And in one of my 5S talks, I spoke about that. I think in the Super Soul talk. The fact that we gain grasp, realization, understanding of the absolute truth God in 3 stages, where the beginning stage is recognition of God in everything around us. Might be like an ocean for some people, or the beauty of nature for others, or the power of the wind, or the fact that God is the energy in everything. So people would say things like God is love, God is energy. So it's a rather impersonal view, because it doesn't strike to the heart of the fact that God is a personality in his own right, but it certainly sees the power of God at work and at play around us. And the next more advanced step is to realize, recognize, and come to know the God in your heart, the super soul. And that's more personal. And then the most advanced stage is when you start to commune with and serve and surrender to Krishna himself, God himself, the absolute truth, the personality himself, as a persona with likes, dislikes, etc. And that is the hardest one to come to. So for many people, they are stuck at the first stage. Now that's good, that stage is there, but it's meant to lead to the next stage. So that's the quest. We need to spiritually develop ourselves so that we can get ourselves to the next stage. And this idea of truth, being affiliated with God himself, is also in the Bible. We have in John chapter 8 verse 32, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Know the truth, with that absolute truth that you're knowing being God himself. Knowing the absolute truth is knowing God, and God will set you free. The knowing of God will set you free. That's what that's saying. 1 John chapter 5 verse 20, and we know that the Son of God has come and has given us understanding, so that we may know him who is true. Him who is true. So once again, direct correlation between God and the idea of being true and the idea of truth. Psalm 86 verse 11, teach me your way, O Lord, that I may walk in your truth. Walk in your truth. Psalm 51 verse 6, behold, you delight in truth in the inward being, and you teach me wisdom in the secret heart. Truth in the secret heart, absolute truth in the secret heart, is having God in your heart, which is teaching one the way. And that is the super soul, which was stage 2 of God realization. So whether we look at the Gita or whether we look at the Bible, the idea of God being truth and absolute truth being unchangeable by any time, any place, any circumstance, always being eternally consistent, that is absolute truth. And all truths that we take to be true in this world, as Gandhi said, are relative truths. So we should tie ourselves to the one and only absolute truth that is reliable and dependable and unchangeable and immutable, and that is to the Lord himself. So I hope that clarifies the difference between absolute truth and relative truth. So the next one will be the letter B, and the topic for that is a thing called bhakti, which I will speak about next week. Thank you very much for coming. Hare Krishna.